Hello all. Today we're going to cover Chapter 1, The Evolution of Psychology, Part 1.1, or just the first part, History of Psychology. This will be recorded in two sections, so you'll have History of Psychology Part 1 and then History of Psychology Part 2. Feel free to watch them together or separate depending on what you want. So first thing we're going to go over is what is psychology. So psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mind. Psychology is derived from the Greek words. Psyche means soul, and logos means study, so it's the study of soul. We'll get into kind of how that came around. But what we like to think of it now is the study of both the behavior and mind. So when we say behavior, we mean actions and responses. So those are usually physical behaviors, but obviously they can also be mental behaviors. And these behaviors are things that can be observed. So things you can see or you can note a difference in. So this may be facial expressions. This may be how someone responds physically to you, whether they give you a hug or slap you. The mind is an internal states and processes, so these are kind of like your thoughts. So the mind is not directly observable. So what we're going to talk about mostly this term is going to be more the behavior aspects, a little bit of the mind, but mostly focusing on the behavior. And then in Psychology 105 is where you'll probably cover a bit more about the psychology of the mind. So with psychology, then there's a large number of fields. So it's a very broad field of science. There's multiple different ways you can look at psychology, and we call these different perspectives of psychology. So again, these are different ways of viewing behavior, or different ways of kind of trying to figure out why something is happening. So first we're going to go through a nice history of how psychology came about. And what I like to call this is the tour of old white dudes. You'll see why pretty easily, where psychology, like many fields of science, has mainly been founded on the backs of old white dudes who thought they were right and were later found out not to be. So, starting with the Greeks. So, way back in ancient Greek time, we had these famous philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Well, they weren't psychologists, but they were philosophers, and they actually had some theories regarding why people do things, why we think certain ways, why we behave certain ways. So they really kind of founded this drive to understand the human psyche. And what they did was, one thing they really did was debated nativism versus empiricism. Little difficult words to say. You'll find out this term. I'm not the greatest at pronunciation, but you can read them and you should understand kind of what I'm getting at. So this is really the debate of, are we born a certain way, or is how we're brought up, how does that affect our psyche and our behaviors going on? So jumping forward a few centuries, few eras, we come to the 1500s, 1600s, and we get this old dude, pretty iconic picture of him, pretty styling, René Descartes. So René Descartes was the big philosopher at this time, again, before we really had anything defined as psychology. And René's big thing was this thing called mind-body dualism. And what he thought was that the mind and the body were two very separate things. So you can kind of think of this as there's an alien in your head controlling your body, right? So kind of like if you've seen Men in Black, that kind of thing. So he was saying that the mind and the body are very separate, and they only really interact via this thing called the pineal gland. Now, you don't need to know what the pineal gland does right now. We'll get into that in chapter 3 and 4. But right now, just kind of remember that that's what connected the two. And so while the mind was in the brain, it was a very separate entity than the body. So you can also think of the mind as, say, like the soul. So this is a separation of the soul and the body. So again, during this time, religion was a big deal. So you can, again, kind of see where he got this mind-body dualism coming around. And again, he believed that no amount of studying the physical body itself can provide information about the non-physical mind. So he was at the impression that understanding how the body works, how do the lungs work, how does blood work, how do muscles work, none of that can provide any information about how the mind works. So coming off of this dualism, then we have this thing called monism. So monism is really just the opposite, saying that there is a combination and that the mind and the body are connected, that they're one thing, that you cannot separate the mind from the body. So this is pretty much saying, you can think of, if dualism is you have the soul and the physical body, monism says, nope, that's wrong. You just have one thing. There's no such thing as a soul that's separate from the body. You've just got your whole thing all in one. And so this was actually a pretty, sorry about that all. So monism was really brought to the front by this guy named Thomas Hobbes. You don't need to know too much about him. Just connect the name Hobbes, Hobbs. So very similar to Sean Hobbs, Fast and Furious. So Thomas Hobbes and monism. Just connect those two together and you're good to go. And so Thomas Hobbes really said that mental events concur in conjunction with physical events, which means that the mind and the body work together, that you think and act at the same time, that they're not two separate things. So monism is a really important idea for psychology, because by having the mind connected to the body, then that allows us to then study and measure physical processes. So we're able to really understand how the mind's working by observing what the body does, which is something that dualism and René Descartes said couldn't happen, right? So this acceptance of monism rather than dualism has really helped forward the field of psychology, and so we now support and understand monism as a field. So if a question in an exam was true, false, psychology is built off of dualism, that would be false. Psychology is built off of monism. Now, you're probably asking yourself, if all of that wasn't psychology, if Hobbes and Descartes weren't the fathers of psychology, which old white dude was? Great question. So the main old white dude that we're really going to focus on for a little bit is this guy, Wilhelm Wundt. The W's are pronounced like V's, in case you were wondering. You'll notice that unlike in the textbook, I don't give you a lot of dates because this is psychology, not history class, so you don't need to know dates. You will kind of need to understand what order your old white dudes came in, right? You're going to want to know that Descartes was older than Wundt, but you don't need to know what years they were. So getting into Wilhelm Wundt himself, we like to call him the father of psychology. So he really helped form psychology as a science. He formed the first research lab in psychology. So that's why we tend to think of him as the father of psychology. Now, were there psychologists before him? Sure, but they didn't actively study psychology in the way that we do now. So he's really the father of modern psychology. And one of the great quotes from him that I'd like to read is, Psychology informs us about those life phenomena that we perceive by our external senses. In psychology, the person looks upon himself as from within and tries to explain the interrelations of those processes that this internal observation discloses. So that really gives us a nice summary of what he wanted psychology to be, what he wanted the science of psychology to be. Now, Wilhelm Wundt, he didn't just study monism, which is what we're talking about. He actually helped start a new perspective that we call structuralism. So structuralism was based on the notion that the task of psychology is to analyze consciousness into its basic elements and investigate how these elements are related. Now, he did have, another guy that he worked with that agreed with him that structuralism is a great way to study psychology. And this was Edward Titchener, another great guy. So if I ask you what field of thought Titchener was connected with, you'll say structuralism. So again, with all these old white dudes, you want to connect their name with what perspective they had. So Titchener was originally in Germany with Wilhelm Wundt. So he studied over there, and then Titchener is credited with moving to the U.S. and sharing his teachings with others in the U.S. and the Americas. So he really helped to spread this idea of structuralism. So more simply, structuralism is the study of the mind in terms of its basic elements. So you're going to break down the mind into consciousnesses, and you're going to really use introspection or looking within. So kind of asking yourself, how does that make me feel? Where did that come from? So it's less physical observation and more personal observation of something happened, how does that make me feel? Or I did something, what made me do that? So that's what introspection is. It's required training to make the subject, the person being studied, more objective and more aware. So Wundt and Titchener would talk to study subjects or even themselves, and they talk to them and they teach people how to be more introspective so that they could then further understand how different people react to different things. Now that's where I'm going to stop part 1 of the history of psychology, and I'll come back and we'll do part 2 in another video so that you guys don't get overwhelmed and if you need a break. Personally, I'm going to go get some coffee. So I'll see you guys in the next video.